welcome back to another Social Web TV. We're back from the dead.
Finally.
Oh, this feels like I've been in hibernation.
And we're back because of you.
By popular request, there were literally dozens of tweets. I'm not sure there are that many, but a lot of, the loyal fans that said they want to know more what's going on the social web, and we just can't stay away.
Yeah.
And Chris, you were in Europe, and I think you heard from fans over the seas.
I mean, we've got fans in Helsinki, in St. Petersburg, in Russia, and Stockholm, all over the place. I was quite surprised, actually.
So thank you for believing in us.
Absolutely. And this week, we're back at the Computer History Museum in Mountain View, California for the Internet Identity Workshop. And yesterday, we're also, was it 2 days ago, precursor to that was the OpenID Summit. And it's the combination of these two events that also spurred a number of you to reach out, say, hey, Social Web TV, could you help us out here? Could you give us a little insight into what's going on at these industry events? So.
Yeah, it may have felt like the pace of innovation had slowed over the last few months, but boy, has it ever picked up again now. And there's a whole lot more building blocks to the social web, as we've talked about, that people are realizing they need to start building and putting together. And I'd say spring is in the air if it weren't November, but it certainly feels like it to me.
Winter's in the air?
Yeah.
And well, it's only been a couple of months since our last official episode, and a lot's happened on things that we've talked about before. So we'll give some updates on things like OpenID. But I think it's also the case that in this episode, we will introduce more new terms than in any other episode before, including webfinger, lard, and the hammer stack,
Not to
among
mention
others.
salmon.
And salmon.
Hub sub hubbub.
Yeah. So let's go.
Let's do it.
What should we do first?
Well, I guess let's start with OpenID, since we just had this OpenID Summit, and we also had a couple of important recent announcements. Loyal viewers may recall that earlier this year, Plaxo and Google working together developed this hybrid of OpenID and OAuth that allows a user to sign up for an account, bringing not just their existing identity with them, but also in one click access to their address book and profile data. And this together provided a kind of a step up in terms of usability and convenience that really started to move the needle in terms of saying, hey, rather than just making a user sign up from scratch, we can say if you're already on Google or if you're already on Yahoo or if you're already on one of these sites, come over and we'll be able to give you a rich experience out of the box. That was actually sort of prototyped, even though it was shared publicly. But as of yesterday, I believe, Google has now rolled out all that stuff that we worked on together as a general package that anybody can use. So that's very exciting because obviously not only lots of Google users, but all of the hosted Google AppSphere domain users can also take advantage of this.
And before that, I think were only a handful of relying parties that were given early access. It's kind of interesting, though, is it was both Plaxo and Facebook. So when Facebook became an OpenID relying party, it was the same hybrid implementation.
Right. Well, I think it's worth pointing out that one of the things that's happening here is that, of course, Facebook has provided a lot of leadership in terms of both how this user experience can work, but also what relying parties want, which is one of the topics you've been addressing while you're here. And I think what it turns out is that identity alone is not quite sufficient to gain wide market adoption of these things. And so the work that you guys have been doing with Google, that is now available, of course, to everybody as this hybrid onboarding, is something that we've seen is necessary, I think, to really push user-centric services and identity, so that you can choose to use a provider that you want to use, but you also need to be able to bring data with you. That's actually part of the value exchange that needs to happen. And so we've taken these basic building blocks, and we're finally starting to see them actually stack up in ways that really improve the user experience and also add value to both the individual user and the web service that's consuming their data.
And I think partly it's because it just fits more naturally with the way users think about the services that they have, right? If I tell you, hey, I'm a Google user, instinctively I don't just think about I have a Google password, but it's also I'm using Gmail or Google Reader or what have you. And so it's nice when the technology can be sort of fluent in the way that a user intuitively thinks about it.
And fortunately, because these solutions are being built with open technologies, it does mean that there's hopefully more choice in the marketplace, because this is now a pattern that other providers can actually adopt and use for their own purposes, their own needs. So on the one hand, you can of course work with and use Google or Plaxo or whatever these different providers are, but it also means that you can start using your own sort of independent solutions if you choose to.
And so, case in point, another announcement recently is that Yahoo also rolled out their own version of hybrid. And when they came to me and said, hey, can you make sure it works? I literally took the code I wrote for Google, pointed it at Yahoo, and it just worked out of the box. Same thing happened for MySpace. And to your point, it doesn't just have to be the big providers. Crucially, little providers can do exactly the same thing. And we see this all the time in Silicon Valley, where a service starts out and it's really cool but only has a small number of users. It's hard for them to get a foot in the door if they have to be one of the big players. But if they can say, hey, I already speak the same language, you've already written the code, just let me in, that potentially is a very powerful democratizing force, and one of the reasons we're so excited about doing this on open standards.
So to be clear, hybrid onboarding, one of the coolest things happening with OpenID, because it's taken it and made it above threshold. It's performing for our business and others better than raw, regular, password-based sign up, sign in. And now we're seeing it roll out to multiple providers. So that's OpenID. There's other things going on in OpenID too.
There's one other thing that I'll say about that. And this happened in September, so it's a little bit delayed. But to your point, and one of the reasons why this building block philosophy I think is very powerful is because on the one hand, in the consumer space, of course, as Joseph said, if you're a startup, you want to make it easy for people to come in and bring data with them. Well, on the flip side, if you're the US government, you actually don't want to deal with any personally identifying information. So one of the great things about OpenID is that it doesn't actually bring any of that data with it as a necessity. Mm-hmm. So the US government actually announced in September that they're going to be starting this pilot program to allow regular citizens to use existing OpenID accounts that they have with Google and Yahoo and so on and other certified providers to sign into government websites and web services, greatly simplifying the burden of creating new accounts to interact with the government, and I hope providing leadership for the rest of both the industry and governments around the world to start thinking about using these open web technologies that are starting to power the social web.
Cool. Any other things from the OpenID Summit? I did see some interesting demos there.
Absolutely. So we talk about hybrid onboarding. There's still a lot of questions of how do you really make this work in a way that is both very usable for mainstream users and also very secure. Hybrid made some important advances, but another area that's gotten a lot of momentum recently is the idea of what if we could actually put a smart client in your browser or on your computer to help you. And there's a lot of reason to believe that that could be a really big help, because one of the big problems that we've probably talked about on this show before is the so-called NASCAR problem of if I want to give you buttons for all the different possible sites you might log in with, it gets pretty overwhelming, like all the bumper stickers on a race car. But if you have a smart client that knows which websites you've been to, it can present you with a friendly list of just the 2 or 3 that are most relevant to you, and the website doesn't have to know all that information.
Well, and even better, I think this notion that browsers are starting to become more interested in this opportunity, specifically Mozilla is here at the Internet Identity Workshop, means that we can start actually talking about what the ideal user experience might be if we were to think about modernizing browsers to deal with the social web. So we've done a couple different prototypes in the past, but I think there's real momentum here. And I also think that there's a great deal of collaboration happening between the OpenID and the Information Card Foundations to really pull together a lot of best practices and ideas for how this might work. In fact, that's one of the sessions that's going to be happening here.
But one of the coolest things I thought at the OpenID Summit was Michael Jones of Microsoft demonstrated one of these prototype browser extensions as an identity selector. And it was really cool. With this, he was able to show logging in, for example, to Plaxo using an OpenID. But it wasn't Microsoft OpenID. It was in 2 different cases, Google and then Yahoo. So I did a blog post entitled something like, what can get Google, Microsoft, Yahoo, and Plaxo all working together? The answer is OpenID. There's this incredible spirit of cooperation and joint problem solving going on around OpenID and this open stack.
Well, and this sort of smart client can also potentially deal with a lot of the big issues that the big providers have around phishing, making sure that when you're being directed, it's the real Yahoo and not some fake Yahoo. So if it's a smart client that knows exactly what URL you're going to and knows which are the trusted sites, which are the sites you've used before, can potentially provide a lot of sort of security and peace of mind on top of that. And the other thing, to echo what Chris was saying, that is really cool about Mike Jones' demo is it's using the built-in standard Windows security UI and framework that all of the other, log in with your smart card or log in with your information card or whatever. So it's actually abstracting away in some sense the fact that it's OpenID per se, and hopefully giving users a very familiar pattern of, here's some service that needs to know who you are, which of these do you want to tell them, and it just kind of works under the hood. So it is really neat, and as they said, this is not meant to be a final solution, but more of a prototype, a sort of a stake in the ground of here's something that sort of works, let's figure out where to take it from. And so I think that's absolutely the right way to make progress is ship early and often and engage the community. So definitely cool to see that stuff.
Well, obviously, we could keep going probably for another hour on OpenID, but we wanted to really use this return episode to kind of highlight some of the things going on and hopefully things that we can dive into more depth in future episodes now that we're back. So which are some of the other topics? Who wants to throw out a term?
One of the things that's been exciting and gaining a lot of momentum, I think, is the Activity Streams project. So we've talked about this on the show before. It's a project that I've been working on for now probably over a year, 2 years. And what's really great to see is that there's, I think, industry consensus coming together around, first of all, this idea, this problem, and second, that we're seeing implementations from MySpace, from Windows, with live.com, and we're getting closer and closer to sort of a 1.0 spec, which kind of means that this bakes enough ideas that we think are consistent and solid enough to actually have people start implementing. So MySpace is moving very quickly in this direction, and another actually entrant into the marketplace recently is called ClickSet. They actually, at cliqsat.com, they actually adopted activity streams and are pushing that out. And there's another smaller site as well called Smart FM, which now has also adopted a bunch of these different technologies. So it's not just MySpace and Windows kind of like colluding together on this. We actually have a pretty vibrant community happening where we're seeing real implementations in the wild, I think hopefully pushing this stuff forward.
Yeah, it feels like it's really starting to get solid. Every time we get together and meet, it's sort of more kind of ironing out the last few details and less of the kind of big existential questions. I guess that brings me to one that I'm excited about, which is, Activity Streams helps you do this pattern that we've seen of syndicating the content that you're sharing out across the web. But one of the downsides of that is that the conversation around those social objects can potentially become fragmented. You've got some comments here, some comments there, some comments everywhere. And there's been no standard way for those comments to flow back upstream. But some guys
you'd have solutions like intense debate and discussing things
you'd
like
have
that,
individual vendor solutions, but
yeah.
It was never kind of a protocol level, right? And as loyal viewers of this show know, you have to get it down to a protocol so that you can really use any provider of your choice.
What if there was some way for the comments to swim upstream, as
back
it
to
were?
their source?
And that brings up salmon, which you'll be hearing more about, something that John Panzer at Google has been spearheading along with some others, where it's, again, a sort of a standard protocol that you can discover, here's the source this information came from, and there's also a place to send comments back upstream. So if, of course you can still have a private discussion if you want, but if you want to be part of the global discussion, there's a standard way to say, when a user comments, for example, you share your blog post into Plaxo, and somebody comments in Plaxo, it would flow back up and it could show on your actual blog, and it could then flow back downstream to the other places. And so that's, again, and it works with activity streams in a harmonious way. I guess that then brings the next piece, as long as we're going to keep rolling down the list, which is all of these models with RSS and activity streams and Salmon are still based on this polling model of everybody's got to check every so often, hey, do you have something new? Hey, do you have something new? Hey, do you have something new? And that really doesn't scale. And so you may have heard of PubSub Hubbub, which, again, sort of started coming out, Brett Slacken and Brad Fitzpatrick and a few others from Google and elsewhere, kind of coming up with a model where instead you could turn the model on its head and actually have those comments pushed out in real time. So if you think about activity streams, when I share something, you can hear all these building blocks are fundamentally complementary to one another and can be used separately, but together they really start to make something magic happen where you can have this kind of seamless, real-time, rich conversation across a distributed social web.
And keeping with the buzzword bingo theme, we've also then can introduce the fat ping.
That's right. So RSS Cloud is another one of these services for doing real-time push. Dave Weiner originally worked on it and it's sort of been brought back. And actually, the two both work quite well. They differ a little bit in terms of the fat ping, meaning that the actual content of the data is pushed out to the sites rather than them having to just get a notification and go fetch it themselves. But that's kind of down in the weeds. I like the weeds, but... and then the last piece, I guess...
on that, I think I'm going to give you the web finger then.
Oh.
Yeah, so gee, okay, let's talk about the last couple here. There is so much going on. It's just it's hard to even thread it together in a coherent narrative. Yes. So we talked about making all this stuff happen across a distributed social web, of course, and we've talked about this before on the show, but the missing piece is how do you glue that all together? How do you actually find out where all these services live, and how do you let a user say, hey, I may use Google Reader, or I may use Bloglines, or I may use whatever, and it just works. And that's generally thought of as discovery, and of course, Mr. Discovery, Aaron Hammer, has been working on a bunch of different protocols to help fit these all together. They go by names such as LARD for link-based resource descriptor, something like that.
LRDD.
LRDD. XRD, which is the sequel to XRDS and XRDS Simple. You can think of it as XRDS Even Simpler, which sort of helps me list in a standard way where I keep my portable contacts
Services,
provider and my
yeah.
OpenID and what have you. And then WebFinger is this idea of how can you access that discovery system when given an email address. So people tend to communicate with each other using email and are used to signing up for websites with an email address. But how do you take an email address and find out more about that person? There hasn't really been a way to do that, and WebFinger sort of makes that possible by providing a standard mechanism to query the email provider for information on that user.
Now, one of the things that I found sort of traveling around the world and talking to people about these different ideas is that we come up with a lot of jargon and a lot of terms and a lot of phrases, as you suggested this episode would be about.
My head's ready to explode.
In some ways, it's one of those opportunities, too, where there's an opportunity to maybe create one more term to encapsulate a couple others. So it seems like a lot of this work that Aaron Hammer has been working on is coming together as sort of like this discovery mechanism for the open web. And right now, it's sort of colloquially being called by common people the Hammer Stack. So
nice.
Very, very close. We'll be having Hammer Real Time with the distributed social web, and for now, I think, it's coming along rather swimmingly.
No.
So I hope that at least gives you a sense. I know that was kind of fast, but you can rewind it and play it back. There's a bunch of these building blocks, and they all have a logical place toward this common vision of, people across the web can use whatever tools and services they want. They can share information with each other in a rich way. They can comment on that information. They can stay in touch with what they're doing, and it can all flow in real time. And that's a really big vision, and no one person is making it happen. And just like with OpenID and OAuth and portable contacts and all that, it came from lots of little efforts that then found a way to come together in a stack that was more than the sum of its parts. And it seems like that's happening yet again in an even bigger way. So it's very exciting. It's that same magic that got us where we are today that's, I think, going to get us to the next level.
And I think the good news is that this means that we're going to have a lot more things to talk about in subsequent episodes.
Absolutely. So, on that note, please make sure to join us whenever we feel like it for another exciting episode of the Social Web TV.